Alright, so welcome back to video 4 out of 4 for the chapter 27 video series. Today we're going to be going over the Vietnam War. So the roots of the conflict in Vietnam. So at the beginning, Vietnam was a French colony and it suffered under colonialism with France. And over time it grew a hard nationalistic communist party that was led by Ho Chi Minh, as seen on the right. And in World War II, when France left to defend its own country, Japan invades Vietnam, and now Ho Chi Minh and his one nationalistic party must somehow defend Vietnam from Japan, which they do successfully. And so Ho Chi Minh gains a lot of popularity and a lot of power. And in 1945, he creates the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And now that the war has ended, the Allied powers must somehow deal with French-Vietnam relations and colonialism. And so Ho Chi Minh had made this communist party. The Americans, who at the time FDR actually supported the anti-colonialism, but after his death, Truman saw that Soviet power and communism was a bigger threat than ending colonialism. And so America supported the French takeover of Vietnam and actually helped finance France's war, though they never actually participated in it. However, Ho's forces defeated the French, and Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel after treaty talks, and an election in 1956 was planned to unite North and South Vietnam. So North Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam was led by a new leader, Ngo Dinh Diem. The U.S. supported Diem and assisted South Vietnam in mobilizing their own military defenses, but Diem's regime was not very popular, and it was met with a lot of backlash and a lot of protest. Some Buddhist monks in protest would actually burn themselves on the streets. So a coup led by military leaders actually ousted Diem, and this coup was supported by America because they wanted to make sure whoever was leading South Vietnam was popular. However, this coup led to an unstable South Vietnam, and a new party in South Vietnam that was actually aided by North Vietnam called the National Liberation Front started to threaten South Vietnam's standing as a democracy, and their forces that were part of this front, the Viet Cong, who are now very famous, actually, started to participate in guerrilla warfare in South Vietnam and were supported by North Vietnam. And so, seeing this escalation and this threat, in 1964, LBJ obtains congressional approval for war, and this is against North Vietnam. And he claims this after North Vietnamese torpedoes destroyed American destroyers. However, what wasn't revealed was that the American destroyers were actually encroaching on North Vietnamese waters and were actually firing upon North Vietnam. This doesn't matter though. War begins, and Congress approves the military response by America in Vietnam, and it approves defending against armed attacks by North Vietnamese troops. And an attack happens in 1965 when the Viet Cong forces attack an American base in Pleiku, and LBJ immediately authorizes bombings of North Vietnam and drops U.S. soldiers. And this is where real escalation starts to happen. So soldiers increased from 25,000 in 1965 to 385,000 in 1966, up to a peak in 1968 when it was almost more than 500,000. And in addition to troops, there were new bombs, fragmentation bombs, and napalm bombs that killed civilians and destroyed villages. In the graph to the right, you can see U.S. deaths during war, and from 1965 to 1968, there's a huge increase, and this is the escalation that we just talked about. So protesting the war, in 1965, the University of Michigan holds first anti-war teach-in. And so there's a lot of backlash to American involvement in the foreign country of Vietnam. And there's a lot of, talk about how Vietnam was trying to gain its own independence just as America had. And there was, back and forth about communism versus, gaining independence and the end of colonialism. Students for a Democratic Society, which was an organization, they supported radical activism, and they attacked ROTC units in campuses. Another organization, Women's Strike for Peace, and other students, they mobilized in marches to stop the war. In 1967, 300,000 people marched in New York City, and 100,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. In 1968, North Vietnamese Tet Offensive was broadcasted on television, and it showed Americans the cruelty and inhumanity of war. In 1969, there was a story that leaked about My Lai, a southern Vietnamese village, and it was a massacre by American soldiers of civilians in that village, and this immediately enraged protesters. Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1969, he reduces American troops to 39,000, but there is no end to the war, and in 1970, American and Vietnamese troops actually invade Cambodia to block North Vietnam. In response to this invasion, there's a massive protest in Kent State University, Ohio, which leaves 4 protesters dead, and there's another protest in Jackson State University, and it leaves 2 people dead. In 1971, the New York Times posts the Pentagon Papers and attempts to expose American involvement in Vietnam and the secret escalation of war. And so finally, peace talks come into the table. In 1972, Nixon runs for re-elections, and he promises peace and negotiations, and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger also agrees with this. However, it's not until 1975 that North Vietnam actually successfully consolidates Vietnam that Congress finally approves, or finally actually blocks, aid and funds to the American war in Vietnam. And so Henry Kissinger was hailed for, ending the war, but at the same time, it was seen as, America had fought to the very end, and it wasn't actually them ending, it was just them losing that ended the war. In total, 58,000 American soldiers were killed, and over $150 billion was spent in Vietnam. In 1971, Nixon softens his stance on China, and he eliminates trade restrictions. And in 1972, Nixon actually visits China, and the trip is broadcasted to America, and it shows a side of China that Americans knew very little about. And even though there's this big thought of communism being totalitarian and autocracy and completely against democracy, the trip shows and the broadcasting shows how China wasn't at all what the Americans thought it was. Nixon also visits Russia and begins an arms limitation discussion, and SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, is signed between the two countries. And so this is really where the cool down for the Cold War begins to happen, and it's the end of chapter 27 as well. And so the Cold War in total, it shows a part of U.S. history after World War II where America, a global superpower, is now threatened by a form of government, communism, that they're very unsure about, and unfortunately they're fearful about. And so you can see how over the course of decades, America opposes communism at every turn, and it's not until decades later do they finally cool down and realize that not everything has to be, one against another. But even still, this is a part of history, and the Cold War is very important to, what America is today and how America became what it is today.